Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we turn stacks of sources into instant insight.
Today, we're on a fascinating mission, really digging into the life and political trajectory of Hu Jintao.
And he's a leader whose entire story, his rise to power, his style, it just stands out as this profound anomaly in modern Chinese political history.
It really is. I mean, this is a masterclass in political survival and maybe above all, calculated caution. We've synthesized sources that cover his entire political journey.
Right.
And we're tracing how this very low-profile organizational man rose from, total obscurity on the Western frontier to the absolute pinnacle of power.
And that gets to our central question, which is really the focus for this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
In a system that you see is so often defined by revolutionary lineage, the charismatic elders or the guys who managed massive economic success on the coast. How did Hu Jintao the Black Horse from the Snow Mountain, as some of our sources really affectionately dubbed him, how did he carve a path that was so distinct?
It's the key question.
Because he was nothing like the revolutionary giants, Mao and Deng.
Mm.
He wasn't that sort of ardently intellectual reformist like Hu Yaobang. He definitely wasn't a powerful, almost flamboyant technocrat like Jiang Zemin or Zhu Rongji. He was something. Well, something new.
He was, and his career path is this incredible study in what happens when adaptability and meticulous procedure triumph over charisma and inherited power.
Right.
So we'll examine the specific formative experiences, that unique mix of his engineering training, his work out in the impoverished interior, and of course the high-stakes crisis management in Tibet, all the things that defined his unique political DNA.
So for you, the listener, get ready for the specific insights you need to understand his singular, very cautious legacy.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this starting point, the world he actually entered. The post-1949 era in China, especially as we get into the 80s and 90s, it was completely dominated by the technocratic class.
It really was.
These were leaders trained in hard sciences, overwhelmingly from one place, right? Tsinghua University. And they were designed to run the complex machinery of a modern state.
That's the key context. You have to understand Tsinghua. It was, without a doubt, the undisputed cradle of engineers for the party.
The MIT of China, basically.
But that's a great way to put it. You look at the Politburo during the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's just packed with Tsinghua alumni. You've got Yao Yilin, Song Ping, who becomes his patron later on, Zhu Rongji, Wu Bangguo.
Well, this goes on.
It just goes on. And the ideology behind it was really simple. If you can build a dam or run a massive factory, you can manage a province, you can manage the country.
But Hu Jintao's entry into this elite technical class, it was already marked by this extreme caution. And it seems to be rooted really deeply in his background.
It is. Our sources highlight his very careful management of his own ancestral identity from day one.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this is where we see his political instincts showing up really early. So unlike the high-profile, often, politically complicated backgrounds of a lot of elite leaders, Hu actively emphasized his ancestry in Anhui, specifically Jixi.
And Jixi is significant.
Very significant. It's a major cultural region. It's home to the historically influential Hu clan, which produced massive figures like the academic Hu Shi. So by emphasizing Jixi, he was giving himself a kind of cultural gravitas, a clean historical lineage.
And what's fascinating is what he strategically downplayed, what he minimized.
Exactly. He actually grew up for 17 years in Jiangsu, in Taizu, which was a much more immediate and potentially complex place to be associated with.
Not like complex.
Just more local history, more recent connections, more things that could be dug up later. And the sources are explicit on this. They note that he actively discouraged media from reporting on Taizu throughout his entire career. And this wasn't just, him being modest. It was an early demonstration of his preference for total control over his narrative. Minimize personal publicity and make sure that his political story was clean and centrally approved.
That sounds like a preemptive political sanitization process. He's erasing any potentially messy local history that could be used against him down the line.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And his family situation, well, it played perfectly into this cautious approach.
He was lucky, in a sense.
It was politically advantageous luck, absolutely. His father was a small proprietor, he owned a tea shop, he was an accountant. Critically, the family hadn't amassed any significant wealth before 1949.
And that was the key.
That was everything. That relative lack of fortune meant they were spared the devastating political violence that came with being labeled a rich peasant or, even worse, a landlord.
And that happened to others in his family.
It did. His own cousin, who had a slightly more successful background, was labeled a landlord during the land reforms and, well, suffered immensely for it. So Hugh's clean slate in the brutal political economy of the 50s and 60s was truly priceless. He had no political baggage.
So he gets to Tsinghua, this institution designed to produce the next generation of power wielders, and his choice of major water conservancy engineering, it seems to follow this exact same pattern of strategic caution.
It does.
Was that a typical path for a student who could obviously get into China's top university?
It was pragmatic and safe. It was not ambitious or glamorous. He certainly had the intellectual ability, but the sources suggest his high school math teacher actually gave him some advice.
What was the advice?
He told him, with your modest family background, maybe avoid the hyper-competitive first-class departments.
So stay away from the stuff like nuclear physics or high-end electrical engineering.
Precisely. The things that would put a big spotlight on you. Instead, go for water conservancy, specifically hydroelectric power. It was absolutely essential for national development, but it was less competitive and much less politically exposed.
It was the most viable, least risky path forward.
It was. And it demonstrates this early inclination he had toward functional reliability over any kind of showy ambition.
And this is where that crucial deviation begins. This is what sets him apart from the pure technocrat. Someone like the source author, Xiao Weigang, who focused on photoelectrical engineering and R&D management. That guy was aimed at technical mastery.
Right.
Hu, on the other hand, he starts focusing on party work almost immediately.
And that shift was completely intentional. In fact, it was engineered by the university itself under the former president Jiang Nangshan. He's often called the godfather of this entire political system.
So Jiang wanted to create more than just engineers.
Much more. He implemented this thing called the political counselor system, and it was explicitly designed to cultivate leaders who were both read and expert. They weren't just looking for brilliant engineers, they were looking for engineer politicians.
So help us visualize this. What did a political counselor actually do on the ground? What is his day-to-day like?
Okay, so think of it as mixing HR management, student life organization, and ideological compliance all into one role. And you're doing this while you're managing your own very difficult technical studies.
So a lot on his plate.
A ton. For Hugh, this meant he wasn't just in a lab solving hydraulic equations. He was managing student discipline, he was overseeing the organizational life of his entire department, and notably, he was deeply involved in the university's cultural work troupe.
The cultural work troupe.
Yes, focusing on activities like dancing and singing. Now, this involvement wasn't frivolous. It wasn't just a hobby. It was direct training in political organization, soft power, and mass mobilization.
Skills you need for party management, not for designing a power plant.
Exactly. These are the skills that define a political career, and that path solidified when he made the decision to enter the party before graduating. That single decision, right there, it seems to define his entire career trajectory moving forward.
It's a critical distinction. He wasn't an engineer first, who then used his skills to manage big enterprises like Zhu Rongji did. Zhu spent years running major state industries.
Right.
Hu Jintao was trained from the beginning as a political operative who just happened to possess a very useful technical degree. He was trained to manage people, to manage discipline, to manage ideology.
Precisely. So when he finally gets assigned to Gansu, a really tough, remote western province, his technical background provides a kind of political cover. It makes him look like one of the technocrats.
But his real work was already administrative and political.
It was. His technical credentials made him fit the required technocratic profile, but his actual job was managing party cadres and navigating that provincial bureaucracy. And that foundation, the blend of technical reliability with meticulous political caution, that would become the hallmark of his entire career. It's what differentiated him entirely from leaders whose experience was purely in economic or industrial management on the coast.
So this brings us to his apprenticeship on the frontier. His career acceleration is really unusual because it happened so far away from the centers of power, from Beijing or Shanghai.
It's very strange. He's out on the harsh northwestern frontier, starting in Gansu, and this gives him a unique grounding that most of the coastal-focused leaders completely lacked.
And those early years were not easy.
Not at all. His early years were defined by hardship and endurance. He survived the Cultural Revolution by doing manual labor at the massive Lujiaxia hydropower station.
So he was really on the ground building the infrastructure.
literally. And that experience gave him direct, non-glamorous contact with the reality of infrastructural development and the lives of ordinary workers. It wasn't theoretical for him.
And once the political climate started to normalize a bit,
He transitioned into political and administrative roles, but still in Gansu, within the Provincial Construction Committee. This provided him with these deep, practical credentials in handling the problems of underdeveloped, non-coastal regions. He knew what poverty looks like up close.
and it was there, in Gansu, that he was spotted. He was noticed by the person who would become his most crucial patron, Song Ping. Let's just clarify for you, the listener, who Song Ping was.
Song Ping was a towering figure in personnel management. He was a senior Tsinghua alumnus himself, and he was seen as this quiet guardian of the party's organizational structure. He was deeply, deeply respected for his integrity and his role in selecting cadres.
He was the ultimate talent scout.
He was. And he was known for having a keen eye for promising but maybe overlooked talent. And he noticed Hu Jintao during a key meeting on economic adjustment.
What specifically was it about Hugh that impressed Song Ping? Was it some brilliant speech?
No, not at all. The source material is very specific about this. Hugh's reporting wasn't charismatic or verbose. It was clear, detailed, and utterly compelling.
So it was about the substance.
It was all substance, it was reliable, it was procedural, and it was focused on practical outcomes. And this impressed Song Ping enough for him to completely bypass the traditional slow ladder of promotion.
He just pulls him up.
He pulls him up, promoting Hugh rapidly from a relatively minor vice section chief position all the way to vice department chief. But more importantly, Song Ping secured Hugh's placement in the Central Party School's training program in 1981.
And that's the golden ticket.
That's the golden ticket. It's a literal entry point into the central government's succession pipeline. And it was based entirely on administrative competence, not political lineage.
So this rapid acceleration propels him directly into the Youth League machine, the Tuanpai network, which would become his structural power base.
Exactly. He moves to Beijing in 1982, and he eventually becomes a top secretary in the Youth League, or CYL, Central Committee.
So he was now part of this vital network, a rising star. But even here, he wasn't the main event. He wasn't the headline act.
Not at all. He was the cautious, competent second in command, the primary rising star. The man who got all the glory and the close personal mentorship was another guy named Wang Xiaogo.
And Wang was very visible.
Very. He was constantly traveling with the then powerful reformist General Secretary Hu Yaobang. So Hu Jintao, our black horse, was initially the stablemate doing all the grunt work in the background.
What kind of grunt work are we talking about here?
Well, while Wang Xiaogo was out basking in the glow of the reform movement, Hu Jintao was the one who took on the increasingly heavy administrative burdens. We're talking about coordinating propaganda, managing the entire organization, liaising with multiple central departments.
So running the whole show from behind the scenes.
It's a role that requires immense political maturity and trusted competency. You're handling all the internal logistics without getting any of the public praise. He proved he could run the organization reliably, especially under pressure.
And that organizational strength was immediately put to the test during the critical 1983 campaign to clear spiritual pollution. For you, the listener, this was essentially a hardline, conservative push against Western cultural and intellectual influence.
This was a pivotal moment, and it's a crucial indicator of his political agility. When the hardliners tried to expand this anti-Western campaign into a major political purge.
Which could have been devastating.
Devastating. The reformist leader, Hu Yaobang, needed a way to subtly push back, to control the campaign's spread without starting an open war. And he chose the CYL, the Youth League where Hu Jintao was placed, to deliver the counter message.
Which was what?
To oppose the campaign's expansion, to keep it contained.
That sounds like walking an incredibly sensitive tightrope. I mean, if he was too zealous in carrying out the campaign, he would be betraying his boss, Hu Yaobang.
Right.
But if he was too open in his criticism of it, he'd be targeted by the hardliners.
It was a classic balance test. And what it showed was that Hu Jintao was already seen as reliable enough to manage a politically sensitive rollback. He didn't become overly zealous, he didn't create new enemies for himself, and he didn't draw any undue personal attention.
He just executed the mission.
He executed it perfectly. And this demonstrated the exact type of procedure-driven balance that the more zealous ideologues or the overtly ambitious reformers just lacked. He could be relied upon to execute a nuanced, difficult policy without making a political spectacle of it.
So after the Youth League, he faces his first major operational test as a provincial leader. He's sent to Guizhou in 1985, becoming the youngest provincial party secretary in the country.
Right.
And our sources, they paint a truly desperate picture of Guizhou's environment.
Desperate is the word. Guizhou was notorious for its triple poverty. There was a saying, no 3 consecutive sunny days, no 3 flat inches of land, no 3 cents in silver. Poverty was endemic. Infrastructure was basically non-existent. It was a place where a leader could not rely on existing resources or establish economic success like they could in the coastal provinces.
So his deep credentials in handling non-coastal poverty suddenly became his greatest asset.
They did. He knew this environment. Given those constraints, his priorities and the choices he made really reflect his background as that cautious political technocrat.
What did he focus on?
His focus was highly rational and structural. He realized the internal root cause of the poverty wasn't just geography, it was generational educational backwardness. So he focused his very limited resources on education.
Which must have been tough with no money.
Incredibly tough. He increased investment despite the extreme fiscal constraints, and he famously focused on institutional morale. He made a public example of officials who harmed or abused teachers, like in the case of Teng Young, to demonstrate that institutional support for education was his absolute top priority.
And what about economically? What could he even do there?
Economically, he chose revenue generators that offered immediate returns. His approach was all about small, fast, high impact.
For example?
He promoted flue-cured tobacco production. It's a reliable cash crop, despite the irony that he himself was a non-smoker. He also supported a lot of small coal mines and local smelters. This was pure pragmatism.
Get the cash flowing now.
Exactly. Secure short-term economic gains and boost the indices that directly impacted poverty alleviation, even if the methods lagged any kind of long-term sustainability.
And the sources do note the severe environmental consequences of those small, fast projects. An issue Hugh never publicly reflected on?
Now,
This seems to underscore his priority. Stability and immediate political goals over any kind of long-term ideological or environmental purity.
it illustrates the political technocrat mindset perfectly. His job, his mandate, was alleviating poverty and achieving stability now. The long-term costs were secondary.
And then the political winds shifted again.
They did. Critically, when his mentor Hu Yaobang was purged in 1987, Hu Jintao had to manage the subsequent anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign in his own province, in Guizhou.
And he did it with masterful caution.
Masterful. He slowed the momentum, he avoided conducting sweeping purges, and he carefully prevented what they call linking up and down.
What does that mean?
It means he didn't allow the campaign in Guizhou to bleed into other provinces, and he didn't let it be used to deeply purge his own cadres. He contained it. This procedural, cautious approach guaranteed his survival while more ardent, outspoken reformers were completely sidelined.
And that successful navigation through all that ideological turmoil set him up for the ultimate pressure cooker assignment. Tibet in 1988. The sources call this the defining moment that launched him to the very top.
It was. Tibet was a political minefield that he inherited from failure. Hu Yaobang's earlier, more conciliatory policies.
What were those?
Things like economic buyouts, political concessions, replacing Han cadres with Tibetans, they had failed spectacularly. In fact, they ended up fueling even more nationalist unrest.
So the central government needed a new approach.
They did. Zhao Ziyang appointed Hu Jintao, hoping he would continue a softer, more conciliatory line based on his reputation as this balanced, careful administrator.
But the reality on the ground, literally within months of his arrival, forced him to make a hard pivot.
A complete pivot. He arrived, and just before the crucial March 1989 riots, the unrest just boiled over. The historical significance here is huge. He was compelled, as the civilian leader, to declare martial law.
Which was not the soft policy Zhao Ziyang had intended.
Not at all. This was pure, decisive maintenance of central authority.
And that decision, declaring martial law as a civilian without a military background, that's what cemented his reputation for being decisive when a core principle was at stake.
Absolutely. There's a widely circulated photograph of Hu Jintao wearing a helmet while inspecting the troops during the lockdown. It's the absolute antithesis of the soft, conciliatory approach.
So he was chosen to implement a soft policy, but under the immediate reality of crisis and the shift in central leadership.
With Deng Xiaoping, Qiao Shi, and Jiang Zemin all consolidating power.
Right. He executed a hard policy.
He did. And the sources quote Deng Xiaoping's action to this exact moment. He said of Hu, "He stands firm on matters of principle and never goes soft."
And that phrase is basically the imperial seal on his succession.
It is. It told the powerful elders who prioritized stability above all else, especially after the failures of the reformists, that Hu Jintao was the man who could be trusted. His survival in that highly volatile, high-pressure, politically charged role, demonstrating the superior political adaptability. That was the critical factor that propelled him past all of his contemporaries and onto the national stage in 1992. He proved that his caution did not equate to weakness.
This is where the narrative takes its greatest leap. The 14th Party Congress in 1992, Hu Jintao's appointment to the Political Bureau Standing Committee, the PBSC.
The absolute inner core of Chinese political power.
It was, as our sources state, the black horse moment. It was a complete surprise to pretty much everyone.
It was a shocking elevation. I mean, at 49, he was incredibly young for the PDSC. But Deng Xiaoping was looking specifically for younger, reliable leaders who had demonstrated both technical competence and an absolute commitment to stability in crisis zones.
And Hu, fresh from his trial by fire in Tibet, fit that very specific, non-traditional mold perfectly.
He did. He didn't have the economic pedigree of the leaders coming out of Shanghai, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, who were managing the booming coastal economy. He was the man from the impoverished interior.
And his lack of coastal experience was simultaneously his greatest flaw and his greatest political asset.
It's a paradox, isn't it? It was a flaw because he couldn't speak the language of massive capitalist-style enterprises like his peers could. But it was a virtue because he provided the geographic and age balance that Deng was desperately seeking for the next generation. He was clean, reliable, and young.
The absurdity of his low profile at this point is just captured beautifully by this anecdote from the 14th Congress press conference.
Oh, that moment is priceless. It says everything. The translator, who was completely unfamiliar with this extremely low-profile 49-year-old cadre being introduced to the world, mistakenly introduced Hu Jintao as a young woman.
No way.
Yes, because his profile was that low. It tells you everything about his political strategy up to that point. His strength was internal political reliability and competence, not external fame or charisma. He was virtually unknown compared to the established provincial powerhouses.
So once he's in the core, he's given this incredibly difficult portfolio of managing party affairs.
Hey.
Organization, discipline, ideology. Our sources label this the not-so-glorious portfolio. Why was this such a poisoned chalice?
Because it put him directly in charge of fighting the party's most fundamental and existential problem, corruption. But here's the catch. He wasn't given the political authority or the structural mechanisms to actually enact meaningful political reform.
So he was tasked with managing the symptoms of a disease he was not allowed to cure.
Exactly. And if you look at the 1990s, with that rapid, almost unchecked economic growth, corruption became rampant.
It was everywhere.
Absolutely. The Central Discipline Inspection Commission, the CDIC, which he was in charge of, was often paralyzed by factionalism and just the sheer scale of the graft. So Hu was stuck in this continuous balancing act, trying to enforce discipline while not alienating powerful regional leaders or stepping on the toes of the senior elders. It was a role defined by internal conflict and, frankly, minimal public glory.
Yet he used this difficult position to actually gain favor with Jiang Zemin, his powerful superior. How did he navigate that?
Through supreme tactical navigation and a complete avoidance of factionalism. The prime example the sources point to is the Chen Shitong case.
Remind us who Chen Shitong was.
Chen Shitong was the powerful, entrenched Beijing party secretary. He gets implicated in a major corruption case that was highly sensitive and politically charged. It was a huge deal.
And who was tasked to supervise this whole thing?
He was. He had to supervise the investigation and the handling of this internal purge. And by executing the case effectively, impersonally, and decisively, without ever turning it into a personal political vendetta, he signaled absolute competence, procedural reliability, and unquestioning loyalty to Jiang Zemin.
He was proving he was the kind of guy who would do the hard, necessary internal cleaning job.
Without aspiring to be the boss himself.
Right. And his national tour during this time also speaks to that same meticulous caution. He visited nearly every province, but deliberately avoided his own past.
It's a fascinating detail. He essentially drew this clean professional line, making sure to skip any place that might give him regional baggage. He consciously avoided revisiting Taizhou, his hometown, Jixi, his ancestral home, and even Guizhou and Gansu, where he spent his formative political years.
Why do that?
It was a calculated move to avoid any appearance of leveraging regional connections or building a personal power base outside of the central party structure. For you, the listener, this is a masterclass in how to navigate succession under a powerful superior. You eliminate any hint of independent regional loyalty, and that ensures central trust.
So as the second term in the PBSC approached, from 1997 to 2002, whose posture shifts into this intense public deference toward Jiang Zemin? This was the final price of succession.
It was the ultimate display of tactical compliance. Hu's dedicated major effort to promoting Jiang's ideological contributions. First, there was the three stresses.
What for?
Jiang Zhengzi, focusing on political alignment, Jiang Zuixi, emphasizing study, and Jiang Zhenqi, stressing integrity. And later, he championed the much more significant three represents.
Okay, let's pause on the three represents for a moment, because this is a really crucial piece of technical context that defines the political shift of that whole era. What did this ideology functionally do?
Functionally, it was a massive doctrinal expansion that fundamentally redefined the Communist Party. It officially expanded the party's base beyond its traditional roots, the proletariat and the peasantry, to explicitly include the broad masses of the advanced productive forces.
And in plain language, what does that mean?
It means entrepreneurs, private business owners, and technical specialists, the very people who were previously considered class enemies, could now officially join the party.
A huge ideological shift.
Massive. And Hu Jintao organized a national speaking tour for this new ideology, signaling absolute fealty to Jiang. This public subordination secured his position as the uncontested successor. It's a strategy that contrasts sharply with leaders who might have tried to subtly undermine their predecessors.
During this transition period, Jiang Zemin also gave Hu two major tests to confirm his capacity to handle highly sensitive fields: the military and foreign affairs. The military test, forcing the divestment of PLA Inc., sounds like political warfare.
It was almost an impossible task, and it was designed to test his authority over the People's Liberation Army, the PLA establishment, before he actually took command.
What was PLA Inc.?
The PLA had grown into this massive commercial empire. It was known as PL Inc. They controlled everything from hotels and real estate to massive smuggling operations. Some sources suggest the annual illegal profits linked to the military reached up to 500 billion RMB.
That's an astonishing number.
It is, and this level of financial corruption wasn't just destabilizing the national economy, it was creating a state within a state.
So Hu was tasked with taking the money out of the military's pockets,
Yeah.
forcing them to divest all of their business holdings. The internal resistance must have been incredible.
Oh, the resistance was furious and absolute. You had generals arguing that these businesses were necessary for troop welfare, for morale.
So how did he manage it?
Hu's success here required a combination of political maneuvering and, frankly, severe financial compensation. Crucially, Zhu Rongji, who was running the economy, had to step in and promise to compensate the military for its massive revenue losses. That smoothed Hu's path politically.
But he was still the face of the command.
He was, and he demonstrated he could issue extremely difficult, painful orders to the armed forces and, critically, have them obeyed. This was the final proof that he was fit to command the military establishment.
Then there was the second test, his foreign policy debut during the 1999 Belgrade embassy bombing. This was a global crisis that ignited massive national outrage in China.
This was a moment of profound national trauma and incredible domestic political volatility. While Jiang Zemin and other leaders were focused on the diplomatic outrage on the international stage, Hu Jintao was tasked with presenting the official government response to the nation.
His speech was a masterpiece of restraint.
It was a masterpiece of restraint and procedural control.
How did his reaction contrast with the national mood at the time?
Well, while the public was focused on raw, justifiable anger, Hu's response was meticulously practical. He affirmed the government's official stance, but critically, he promoted restraint and civilized methods for protest.
So he was trying to manage the anger?
He was. He implicitly warned against allowing the widespread anger to spiral out of control domestically, or, even more critically, to turn inward against the party's own handling of the crisis. He avoided giving any political ammunition to external enemies through inflammatory rhetoric.
So this cautious, procedure-driven pragmatism, even in the face of national trauma.
It demonstrated a superior ability to manage a crisis without making a political mistake, a style that was distinctly different from any of his more emotionally or ideologically driven peers.
So if we synthesize everything we've covered so far, Hu Jintao's distinguishing style is just completely unique in this context. He wasn't a revolutionary, he wasn't a flamboyant orator, and he certainly wasn't an economic savant.
No, he was the organizational man par excellence. His hallmarks were his incredibly low profile, his cautious demeanor, and his absolute commitment to established procedure.
And his speeches were often criticized for being, well, boring.
They were. His written speeches were often seen as bland, especially when you compare them to Zhu Rongji's dynamism or Jiang Zemin's grand theorizing. But his meticulous adherence to organizational norms is what earned him the reputation that mattered most to the elders.
Which was?
He was the predictable, reliable cadre who would not, under any circumstances, mess things up.
And that reliability was entirely rooted in his unique power base, the Tuan Pai Network, from the Youth League.
Correct. His power base was focused on ascent through the organizational structures of political mobilization and administration. This contrasts fundamentally with the princelings who rely on family lineage and inherited political capital.
Or the Shanghai clique.
Or the Shanghai clique, which was all about economic management and coastal development. Hugh's energy was dedicated entirely to building internal institutional alliances and loyalty within the party bureaucracy itself.
And we can't overlook the impact of his unique geographic exposure.
That is a massive difference, and it's something people often forget. Most of his peers had political careers that were focused exclusively on the wealthy, hyper-developed coast and the major cities.
Right. They knew Shanghai, they knew Guangdong.
Exactly. He used extensive tenure in Gansu, Guizhou, and Tibet, China's most challenging and impoverished regions, gave him this raw, unfiltered perspective on deep-seated poverty, the complexities of ethnic relations, and the challenges of social stability on the frontier.
So he arrives at the core not just as a manager of industry,
But as a seasoned crisis manager of human and social systems. And that gave him a broader, more grounded worldview than the coastal elite had.
this cautious, methodical trajectory, it all culminates in his symbolic trip to Shibaipo in 2002, which was shortly after he officially assumed the general secretary position. And he explicitly invoked Mao's famous phrase about going to Beijing for the exam.
This trip was his tone-setting journey. It was his implicit acknowledgement of inherited failures. By invoking the exam, he wasn't just paying homage to Mao, he was implicitly recognizing that Mao and Zhu Enlai did not pass the governance exam.
How so?
They led the nation into immense catastrophes like the Cultural Revolution. Furthermore, he was recognizing that Jiang Zemin's era, for all its economic growth, was defined by the deep-seated structural crisis of rampant corruption and a severe erosion of party morale.
So the message to the new generation of leaders under him was clear. You are here to correct historical errors.
Absolutely. The sources refer to 2003, his first full year in power, as a year for rebuilding morale and correcting historical inertia. They call it a big turn, or Guaido 1.
And his early handling of the SARS crisis was the first major test of this new leadership philosophy.
It was. And he demonstrated immediate decisiveness. He fired the Beijing mayor and the health minister, signaling that administrative competence and responsibility would now be prioritized over political cushioning and saving face. That immediate display of accountability marked a distinct break from the political maneuvering that had characterized the preceding decade.
Ultimately, then, Hu Jintao's path wasn't defined by revolutionary fire or intellectual flash or early economic brilliance.
No.
It was defined by political survival, cautious loyalty, administrative competence in environments that were designed to destroy careers, and a deep, deep understanding of organizational politics. He was selected because he was the least likely candidate to disturb the system.
He was the survivor. He was the one who excelled in the roles nobody else wanted, demonstrating consistently that he was fundamentally reliable and procedure-oriented. He successfully navigated the most challenging postings, Tibet, the party's internal discipline mechanism, forcing the PLA divestment by consciously being the antithesis of the showy, self-promoting politician.
That was the unique genius of the balanced horse.
It was.
Yet the very same source material that explains his ascent also suggests a potential constraint on his time in power. The analysis suggests that true, deep political reform requires soul and courage, tempo. And these are qualities that are not simply inherited, but must be, as they put it, practiced or forced out.
And that brings us to the final provocative question that will leave you, the learner, to ponder. Hu Jintao, the ultimate survivor, finally achieved the leadership position. But his signature caution was precisely the quality that ensured his ascent. His ability to truly lead remains constrained by these profound inherited political challenges, including rampant corruption and the lingering influence of his predecessor.
So the question is, will the immense pressures of governing, the continuing exam that he referenced at Chibaipo, will those pressures force him to acquire the courage necessary to address the fundamental structural problems that confounded his predecessors?
Or will the caution that ensured his political survival ultimately prevail, limiting his legacy to one of stability rather than profound structural reform? That is the real test of his era and the historical dilemma he faced.